I'm going to go over sort of a basic overview of what a politics dissent is, sort of the various models that could be used. I'm not going to talk about elections, but maybe we could chat about that at the end, time provided. But since we don't have an election coming up anytime soon, we won't focus on it. Instead, we'll talk about like agenda and legislative politics. We'll talk about some best practices for constructing politics disads, and finally, how to answer them. Mostly like a normal disad, but there are a couple of tricks and techniques that you might want to consider. So first of all, defining politics disads. A politics dissad basically argues that the app's plan will have negative political ramifications. A lot of people think that politics dissads are illegitimate because they do something wacky and because they are, and you'll hear this said every now and then, not intrinsic to the affirmative, meaning that they are not necessarily means that essentially they're not directly connected to the topic. I think that that is a very limited point of view, and I don't agree with it at all. The reason is that politicians and policymakers are always considering political ramifications of their disadvantages, right? If you think that Barack Obama and his chief of staff and his team at the White House are not carefully considering exactly which political buttons to push and which maneuvers to make constantly, then you just don't know very much about politics. The order in which you approach like an agenda and sort of building momentum to get things passed at certain times of the year is absolutely critical to passage. If you go around just waving magic wands and making policies happen all of a sudden, well, there are repercussions to that as well, right? It changes the political calculus, it changes the stakes, and that can result in potentially large disadvantages. So typically you will see three types of politics disads. There's like bill good disads, bill bad disads, and sort of executive agency disads. A bill that's currently on track for passage fails as a result of the plan. That would be an argument that says the bill is good, right? It's going to pass in the status quo, the plan derails it, and that is an unfortunate consequence. The bill is good. A bill bad disad would be an argument that says there's a bill that is failing in the status quo and ends up passing for some reason as a result of the affirmative plan. And finally, the president or executive agency, they actually have a ton more policymaking authority than we often give them credit for, and I think that this is one of the more underused types of disadvantages. It's basically an argument that says you change the political decision-making of an executive agency or of the White House or something along those lines. One of the disads that I got the most mileage out in my whole career was a disad that we ran in this category. Right after Barack Obama took office, he was weighing his options with North Korea, and the question was, do we want to sustain a policy of sending aid to North Korea? We argued that he would send aid to North Korea in the status quo, but any sort of plan that made him look kind of weak on foreign policy or that exposed him to criticism from the right would encourage him to take a harder line stance towards North Korea and cut off aid pending future negotiations. And that would obviously have disastrous consequences. So what's really nice about that third category is when you have a political climate like we do today where there's just absolute stalemate and nothing seems to be getting through, it really limits your options because you can't read like Tea Party Backlash links very well when the Tea Party is just batshit opposing everything they can possibly think of to oppose. So you have trouble like triggering a link argument in that scenario. But the executive's ability to make rules and establish new policies without any legislative passage makes this a valuable option for politics dissad. I want to point out here that politics disads are based on the consequences of the plan and not on the way the plan gets passed. And this is a point of contention and confusion. We actually used to, back when I was debating, get away with quote, horse trading links, which are arguments that are like, well, in order to get your plan passed, Senator McCain would have to make a compromise with Senator Graham and support this other bill as well, right? The problem with those links is that they don't assume a really fair world of fiat. Fiat means that the affirmative team is allowed to test the consequences of their policy, to test whether or not their policy, if implemented, would be a good idea. A horse trading link or something similar to that that is about how the bill gets passed, on how the bill gets forced through Congress or actually established as a law, does not allow the affirmative a fair test of whether the plan is a good idea, because it's all about political ramifications prior to passage. So when I talk about politics, and I'll be going in depth on kind of the link debate in politics, all of those link arguments are going to be based on consequences after the plan happens, okay? That's an important distinction. Anytime you're up against a politics dissent and someone reads some sort of horse trading link, some sort of link about the way in which the plan passes, you should respond by saying that that's not how fiat works. We are allowed to test whether the plan is a good idea as a policy, not how much political capital would have to be expended in order to get it passed. Because it's nonsensical to talk about horse trading because you don't know who would support the plan or who would oppose the plan. Nobody would support the plan in the status quo, or no one is supporting it. That's your inherency, right? So if they're allowed to make those sorts of arguments, they get infinite links. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you repeat that response to horse trading links?
Yeah, I would just say that's not how fiat works. The affirmative gets to test whether or not the plan is a good idea as a policy, not whether or not the president has sufficient political capital to accomplish the plan. It's nonsensical to insist that we talk about how the plan gets passed because no one is trying to pass it in the status quo. That is the inherency argument for the affirmative. Okay, so I'll run through this really quick, right? This is politics type A, that first scenario I talked about, which is like a bill good argument. It says that X bill is going to pass in the status quo, let's say immigration reform. It's going to pass because key Democrats and key members of the GOP support it in a bipartisan fashion. It's been moving forward on the docket. Immigration is passed in the Senate. It's just pending a vote in the House. So I'd probably also make some argument here about how Boehner is going to allow a floor vote, and everybody seems to agree that if it gets a floor vote, then it's going to pass. The link argument would be an argument that says the plan causes the bill to fail for some reason. This could happen in a number of different ways. It could be backlash from key supporters. Some Republicans decide they're no longer on board because of the lefty liberal plan text that just got passed by Congress, presumably in a rammed through sort of fashion. It could be as a result of a loss of popular momentum, like a focus shift. Now everybody is talking about the plan and the political consequences of the plan, rather than focusing on advancing this other element of the legislative agenda. It could be an argument that changes the president's mind and he decides to veto or to not encourage passage of the bill through Congress. Whatever the link is, the impact is always going to be that the bill is super important and failure to pass it would result in huge consequences. Yes?
Could you do when it's going through, this bill put in place will knock out another bill?
Okay, so that is a docket link, and no, I don't think that you should get to do that. I think that's basically the same as a horse trading link, because when we assume fiat, we assume instant passage of the plan. We just get to wave a magic wand and it occurs.
Right.
I don't think that incorporated with fiat is the assumption that debate takes place in Congress and takes up a bunch of time, therefore displacing other items on the docket. You will occasionally hear people make that argument though. I think the good response to it is no, we get to assume immediate passage of the plan with no additional floor debate. That's the only way to effectively test the merits of the policy rather than implementation of the policy. Yeah. Otherwise, here's a good test for that, right? Otherwise, the affirmative could read dockets as an advantage. They could be advantage 2 is that by passing our plan right now, we would stall time in the Senate or the House and result in them not having time to vote on immigration reform during this session. And then immigration reform is bad or something like that, which would obviously be a pretty abusive extra topical advantage. Yeah.
How do you prove uniqueness? In the terms of when there's no piece of evidence, how can you?
Well, you should have evidence. You absolutely need evidence. What you'd be doing is, if you're reading a politics dissent, you're probably up the night before the tournament, pouring through news articles and trying to find quotations from key members of the Senate and the House saying, yes, we're in support of this bill. Yes, we think it's likely to pass, etc. Right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of other ways you can jury-rig the uniqueness in the link debate. To make those arguments sound a little more compelling. You're probably not ever going to win a 100% risk that X bill is going to pass in the status quo. But if you win a 90% risk, then you can still win a pretty big impact on the dissent. Make sense?
Well, I guess at least when I was in high school, we would win rounds based on the time that the card was publish or something.
Right, yeah. I've talked with some policy debaters about this in the past. I think that because you're not reading cards and time frame specificity is much more inexact, typically what people look to is specificity of the argument that you are advancing. So, if you've got some general argument about how it's non-unique because Republicans as a whole don't support passing immigration reform, and I've got like the names of 5 specific congressmen who are really influential and like the heads of various committees and bring votes with them
Okay, so like,
who support the
you
bill,
have,
then
like,
I'm
a
at.
scenario about Raul Labrador and how he's like super key to immigration passage because he's on the committee or something like that.
Precisely, yeah, and that's a lot less time frame dependent, right?
Alright.
But I mean, every now and then, if there's breaking news that like the AF team knows about and the neg team doesn't, then that could become relevant in politics.
Alright.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, though. A lot of this stuff will be contingent on like specific knowledge of the current status of a particular bill. And a lot of people get frustrated with politics disads. There have been many cases of people misrepresenting politics disads, and I think that if you're answering one of these arguments, you've really got to be on your toes and ready to call bullshit. Typically, most politics disads, though, revolve around a major piece of legislation, like immigration reform, that's all over the news, that everyone knows something about. The ones that get you in trouble are like the weird little side bills that could have a significant impact, but nobody has done that much research on. They also tend to be the most effective politics disads, by the way, because no one can answer them effectively. Okay, so there's the impact. The type B politics disad is much easier to win in our current political climate. It goes the other way, says that X bill is going to fail in the status quo. There's opposition from key members of the House or Senate. There's a veto threat on the table. Boehner isn't going to allow a floor vote on it. There will be a filibuster, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. Bill will not pass in the status quo. The link argument is that the plan causes the bill to pass, and the impact is that the bill is a disaster. A good example of like maybe a semi-real world scenario for this would be the National Defense Authorization Act that Obama signed into law last winter. He was on the fence. He actually threatened to veto it because of the provision about detaining American citizens indefinitely, and then revoked that veto threat and ended up signing the bill into law because he didn't want to defund the entire military, I suppose, or maybe Republicans were going to put up a fight about it. That would have been great potential for politics disad, at least conceivably, because, if it's not going to pass in the status quo, that tends to be a much easier argument to win than it will pass in the status quo. The trick, though, is you need a much bigger link argument to trigger passage.
Yeah, like what is the link? Like the plan makes the certain senator so popular that he or she is able to push it through or something like that?
That could be a potential link argument. Another could be that the plan would somehow make a case for the need for this particular project. So a good example, we read this disad called PGS, Prompt Global Strike, about a Pentagon plan to retrofit ICBMs, like ballistic nuclear missiles, with conventional warheads and fire them at Afghanistan or whatever. And we said this would be a bad idea because China and Russia would think that they were getting attacked with nuclear missiles. So our uniqueness argument was PGS defunded in the status quo. Or at least its funding had been substantially reduced. It wasn't going to be operational for a really long time. They were killing off the program. And our link arguments would sometimes be stuff like, well, you have taken away this other military option, which is going to make generals start pushing really hard to get PGS back because it becomes strategically more important, or something along those lines. Make sense?
Sure.
Cool. Obviously they'll vary on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Or is another link argument like the plans will win for Republicans and therefore they have political capital to push through like X legislation?
Yeah, potentially. I tend to not like those sort of very generic winners win, winners lose type arguments. I don't think that they offer enough specificity on the link level for a politics debate against a pretty good team. But yeah, that's one of the old standards, right? It's like a winners win scenario. Somebody gets a bill passed and now everybody wants to pass all the other bills. Okay. And then finally, the sort of executive agency POTUS type disad. The uniqueness argument is that the president will make X decision in the status quo, for example, send aid to North Korea. The link argument is the plan causes the president to make a different decision, and the impact is that that decision is bad news bears. What he was doing would have been a much better One trick that I will mention here that can be really useful is that your uniqueness on politics disads can very often implicate what is going on in the affirmative case. Okay, so for example, we're reading a uniqueness argument that says that the president is going to send a bunch of aid to North Korea. Imagine that the affirmative case is something about like Japanese relations. Okay, well this uniqueness argument could have substantial bearing on Japanese relations, as could the Lincoln and impact debate. But sometimes if you want to be tricky, what you could do is kick out of a politics dissad, but still extend like a uniqueness argument, and then cross-apply it to the case, and be like, whoops, secret case attack hidden in our dissad. So clever, huh? Okay, everybody got that? If you want it. Cool.
So would this kind of be like a uniqueness determines the direction of the link in this type of scenario?
Yes, always. I mean, uniqueness always controls the direction of the link, which is a nifty little phrase that just means that if the president is definitely going to send food aid to North Korea in the status quo, then the affirmative cannot win a link turn, because the link turn would just say the plan causes the president to send food aid to North Korea. But we're making an argument that he already does that. So the plan, if the negative team wins their uniqueness argument, like 100%, then the affirmative team cannot generate a link turn to the dissad, right? So
But if the negative is winning so much uniqueness, can the uniqueness overwhelm the link?
yes, and that's something we'll talk about in a minute. Yeah, politics dissads can be kind of a tightrope, because you have to win that it is possible for the plan to cause a change. And if you're winning that, like, there are 700 different reasons why the president is definitely going to send aid to North Korea, then it's very unlikely that the plan will cause all 700 of those reasons to suddenly go away. That would be uniqueness overwhelms, which really is. Okay. So we're going to talk about a couple of the conventional weaknesses of politics dissads. One weakness is the brink argument, and that's a picture of the three bears, because this speaks to exactly what the questioner was asking about the possibility of uniqueness overwhelming the link. We want a dissad that is unique, but not too unique. It has to be right in the middle and just right, so that baby bear can eat it or sleep in it or whatever he does. Okay, so politics dissads require careful balance. If you don't have any evidence that the bill will pass, then your politics dissad is going to be non-unique. If you cannot win that immigration reform will pass in the status quo, you cannot possibly win an argument that the plan causes it not to pass. It's already not passing. In fact, there would only be a risk that the plan could help immigration reform to pass. However, and so that's not a good scenario, obviously. However, the alternative is having too much evidence that immigration reform will pass in the status quo. If we make a whole bunch of arguments about how every single senator and congressperson in office is in support of immigration reform, then it is exceedingly unlikely that the plan will cause immigration reform to not pass. And that would be a uniqueness overwhelms the link argument that says essentially the impact of your politics dissad is 100% inevitable. So a brink argument provides us a threshold for an impact. A brink argument will be somewhere in the uniqueness. I usually made it like the last uniqueness argument, and it'll say something like, this bill will pass, but it can only pass with the support of the blue dog Democrats, or something along those lines. And I would have justifications for why blue dog Democrats key to pass this particular bill. And that sets me up to then make a bunch of link arguments about why the blue dogs would be super ticked off in a world of the plan and no longer support immigration reform, or something along those lines. You need to be thinking, as you're writing uniqueness arguments, about the possibility of reading links that relate to them. If you were in my dissads lecture yesterday, we talked about pairing uniqueness and link arguments. That rule holds especially true for politics dissads. You always want to do that. You want to be isolating particular senators or congressmen or particular factors in terms of making a decision, and then reading link arguments that directly relate to those uniqueness claims. If you don't do that, then you're going to be in trouble. Another way of thinking about this is the status quo has to be tenuous. You can't win a politics dissad very well in a world where the status quo is like set and determined. Another thing you want to think about in this regard is how you characterize political interests. If you have read a bunch of arguments that say that various members of the GOP and Senate Democrats both like this bill because they think it is a good policy that will like help lots and lots of Americans or whatever, then it's going to be very difficult for you to win any sort of backlash link type argument. Because why would they backlash against a bill that they already genuinely think is going to be good for America? They wouldn't do that. It's part of their legislative agenda. They wouldn't backlash against themselves. So you often will want to make uniqueness arguments that are like, Blue Dog Democrats are willing to support because they've received an exceptional amount of pressure from the Oval Office to get this item on the legislative agenda done. And then the plan like exerts that influence elsewhere, or the plan evaporates Obama's influence with the Blue Dog Democrats by making him less popular, or something along those lines. If your argument is the Blue Dog Democrats love this bill because it's going to help everyone who lives in their district, why the hell would they turn against it? They wouldn't. It's their bill. With me there?
Will you just define tenuous?
What?
Will you just define the word tenuous?
Tenuous. Oh yeah, tenuous means like wobbly, circumstantial.
Fragile.
Okay.
Yeah, fragile.
So like on the tipping point.
Exactly. So politics are a bit of like a tightrope wire, right? And the guy's like walking across it. You don't want to go too far in one direction or the other; you'll fall off. Yeah.
Yeah, the way Will Chamberlain explained it is like SWO is either really awesome or really fragile.
Yeah.
That and completely collapse that. So.
There you go. Nailed it. Okay. Next. Link arguments. Okay, this is where most politics essays go wrong and start to sound really crappy. You guys will be saved from reading terrible politics essays if you pay attention to this particular slide and you do your homework. So there are a lot of different types of politics links that you can see thrown around. One of the most common, but I don't think one of the better ones, is the backlash link. I think this is kind of lame, but it has the advantage of almost always being available as long as the plan is opposed by someone in the status quo, which it certainly will be, otherwise it would probably be law already. So this argument basically says the plan is going to tick off X group of lawmakers, so they're going to retaliate by stopping the bill from passing. For all these link examples, I'm going to frame them as like a bill good scenario, where the bill's passing the status quo and the plan makes it not pass. You can just invert them, and it should work in more or less the same way. Okay. Couple reasons that I don't like this argument, at least not very much. I mean, still throw them in potentially, but the first reason I don't like this argument is the reason we just discussed. Why would people backlash against the bill they genuinely support? You've got to do a lot of extra work to show that they support it, but they don't totally support it, or they support it for weird reasons that could easily evaporate. Another reason why I'm not a huge fan of the backlash dissad is that it's very difficult to win that they will retaliate against the particular bill that you are reading as your dissad scenario. Like, if your dissad is immigration reform, why would the politicians who are angry backlash on immigration reform? Why wouldn't they backlash on debt ceiling or some gun control bill or any of the other myriad items on the legislative calendar over the next few months? You've got to have some reason why your bill is going to trigger their backlash. It might be that that bill is at the very top of the docket and that it's like the most visible item, and so that's where they're going to gravitate towards and be like, screw you, Obama. But that doesn't seem to be a particularly good claim. Sometimes if your politics dissad sort of intersects with the topic that the affirmative is reading, then you might be able to show that they are actually directly related. Like if it was a border security act or something like that, then there would be obvious implications for an immigration reform bill. But if it's something like, and actually, immigration reform has the advantage of, it actually becomes a bit broader, because let's imagine the app is something like universal preschool. Well, then there would be a question of whether or not undocumented immigrants or people on a path to citizenship would have access to that universal preschool. It becomes a spending question, and then maybe backlash starts to make more sense. But you've got to have some reason why this bill attracts backlash. I think pressure links, and these could be like constituent pressure or political pressure, whatever you want to call it. I think that pressure links are much, much stronger, but they're also usually a bit harder to find. To give an example of this, let's imagine that the plan is something way out on the left wing. It's something like universal preschool. It's like a major spending bill that's going to cost a small fortune, but still have some positive impacts. Okay. Well, in that world, that's a pretty left-wing plan. I mean, education for everyone? Are you serious? Even if it is effective, the GOP is not going to be down. So In a world where that bill has just passed Congress, Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and all of their friends on Fox and Friends are going to be absolutely livid. They're going to be talking 24/7 for at least a week about how the president is turning America soft and into, the People's Republic of North America instead of the good old USA or whatever, right? Very easy to imagine this scenario occurring with a lot of left-wing plans. So the argument here is, in that world, if you are a moderate Republican, it becomes really important for you to track back to the right wing as quickly as possible in order to make sure that you don't get beat by some Tea Party nut job in your next primary. So a world where a massive left-wing spending project has just been advanced on the American people out of nowhere is a world in which the moderate Republicans have every incentive to start opposing every other left-wing bill and staying as far to the right as possible in advance of their primaries. Yeah.
So this is kind of like a lame duck kind of argument. Do you know what I mean? Okay. It was like back when they changed the date, or like how much power presidents had before they left office.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like they've got a limited amount of time, they may not get elected, there's this chance, and so they're just functioning.
Oh, well, it's actually, yeah, that could be the way you characterize this argument, that essentially they start advancing their conservative agenda more strongly because they feel like their time frame is limited. What I was thinking was more, they track back to the right so that they are more likely to win in their Republican primaries because they're worried about looking too liberal or too soft and losing to like Todd Aiken or something like that. But your scenario works as well. These sorts of pressure links can work pretty well because sort of political considerations like that do seem to be the primary driving factor for how most people in Congress and the Senate vote. So I think those arguments can be pretty compelling. And they just require a bit of research to figure out. District links can be really useful depending on what the affirmative is, particularly useful for bill bad stories. The argument here would be that the plan is going to hurt XYZ state or district. The plan is going to hurt Nebraska, or the plan is going to hurt Florida. And as a result, that senator or Republican is going to push for our bill in order to compensate. For the PGS dissent, for example, we would read links like this sometimes. If the plan sort of cut spending out of New Mexico or something like that, we would read a bunch of arguments about how critical components of the prompt global strike system would be contracted out to firms in New Mexico. And then we would make some arguments about why the New Mexico delegation in Washington would push really hard to bring PGS back to replace the funding for their district that they just lost, or something along those lines. This could come up a lot in things like the Farm Bill, like farm subsidies could have a big impact there. Sort of depends on the scenario. Lobby links can sometimes be extremely useful depending on the plan and depending on the relationship between the plan and the bill that you're talking about or the decision that you're talking about in your politics is at. The idea here is that the plan takes off X influential lobby group, and so they demand a change in status on another piece of legislation. Knowing kind of who the really, really powerful lobby groups are makes this extremely valuable. The IPAC, the American Israel something committee, is exceptionally powerful. AARP is really, really powerful. The NRA, of course, is really powerful. There are indexes that sort of attempt to estimate how important various lobby groups are. Kind of keeping track of them and figuring out when you can toss in one of these links can be really valuable. And finally, media and focus links. I think these are almost always ultra generic, but I guess they could become more specific. This is an argument that says basically the plan shifts media and public focus off of a particular bill, and that results in it failing or passing. A good example of maybe this coming up would be the gun control bill that was advanced in Congress after Sandy Hook, right? So that bill did not end up getting passed, but it was like relatively close. Kind of amazing that it didn't get passed, that we couldn't pull off background checks. Wow, tells you something about the NRA, right, on the lobby link. But so imagine that some like horrible incident had happened like the week before that vote in Congress. it would have become much, much easier for people in Congress to kind of shuffle that gun control bill off to the side if media focus had suddenly been radically shifted somewhere else, or if the popular focus was no longer on passing a gun control bill. They probably could have avoided having a vote in the first place. So a massive change to the status quo, like the plan, could result in similar things happening. This can also, you can sometimes get away with these arguments just in terms of like legislative staff. When a new bill gets implemented all of a sudden, I think it's fair to point out that like groups like the Congressional Budget Office and all of the handful of like lawyers that work in dank caves in Washington and figure out what new rules actually mean probably have to start spinning their wheels going to work on something else, and maybe that distracts them from some other mission going on, like typing up the bill that you want to pass. So there are links like that can work, but the problem is they are usually incredibly generic and can be applied in tons of different circumstances, which is an issue, as we will talk about in a moment. Any questions about link arguments? Okay. General rule for politics disads: the more specific your link arguments are, the stronger your disad will be. This is almost always the weak point of a politics disad. This is why politics disads are much maligned among some sectors of our community, because people read nonsense generic links that are easily answered, and the disad just gets tossed. So good link specificity will make these arguments extremely viable. Let's talk about deploying politics and kind of the strategy behind this argument. And I should say as a disclaimer that I was a very avid politics debater. And when I coached at Whitman, I kind of introduced it to them, and they became like very avid politics debaters for at least a couple of years. Most of their teams have moved in a more critical direction since I've left, but I know they still run a lot of scenarios. So not everyone will be as fond of them as I am, I guess, but I think they're great. So first of all, politics is great because it's an easy net benefit to a ton of different counterplans. And it's a net benefit to counterplans that almost always solve the entire affirmative or come damn close to it. Any alt-actor counterplan where the affirmative actor is the USFG, and you're like Brazil should do the plan, is a great one to use on politics. Because the politics disad obviously does not apply to the Brazilian government. Courts counterplans can be really effective with it too. A courts counterplan is where you have the Supreme Court rule that the plan must be implemented by the relevant parties or the states or whatever. Obviously, doesn't link to politics, at least not directly. Although there are some scenarios in which people can argue relatively persuasively that a Supreme Court decision does have political ramifications that might be similar to your link arguments. For example, imagine that there is a gay rights bill pending in Congress when the DOMA decision came down this summer. When that decision came down, it probably triggered like a wave of backlash among right-wing Republicans who would have been much, much more opposed to passing the gay rights bill in Congress post-Supreme Court decision than prior to a Supreme Court decision, at least conceivably. So there's some interaction there, but it's usually pretty limited. States is another good argument. States counterplan, that old classic, great for domestic policy options that don't require significant federal spending. One issue there, though, is that the permutation can sometimes be said to solve the politics disad, because if all 50 states in the United States pass a bill, and Congress passes a bill, it looks like there is just universal consensus that the bill is a good idea. So why would anyone backlash about it? Why would anyone be super upset? Teams will make this argument. But that argument also seems to imply a sequencing of states pass first and then Congress passes, which is not an accurate description. So, XO means executive order. This one comes the closest to directly linking to politics, but if your politics scenario is entirely contingent on a vote taking place in Congress, which some of them will be, then you can totally get away with this. You can just say President Obama should issue an executive order doing the plan, avoid the vote in Congress, and therefore avoid the link to politics. Obviously, that wouldn't work if your politics disad is contingent on President Obama behaving in a particular way, though. Delay is a cheater counterplan, but politics can be a great net benefit, like delay 6 weeks until immigration reform has been passed, delay until after the election, whatever. That's obviously cheating. And finally, CONAM, short for Constitutional Amendment. Under normal processes, or what we would think of as normal processes for passing a constitutional amendment, there would still be like deliberation and a vote in the House and Senate. But we have an alternative. What is it?
No. Sorry.
There's an alternative to passing a constitutional amendment through the House and Senate.
Majority of the states.
Constitutional convention. So there are two ways to amend the Constitution. The first is the Senate and the House pass a bill, and then what is it, 2/3 or 3/4 of the state have to ratify that bill. And then it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. That's the conventional process. That usual process links to politics, though, because it still uses the Senate and the House. So you could not use a Con Am counterplan in that sense with a politics dissent. However, a constitutional convention bypasses the Senate and the House entirely. It's like a meeting of the states to functionally write a new constitution through which an amendment could take place. So that would not link to politics. It does create a whole mess of other problems, though. So keep that in mind. Do what? Oh yeah, and I should say too, on EXO, sometimes you can get away with it more by just using the executive agency directly and bypassing the White House entirely. So for example, I believe the EPA is technically empowered to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant in the status quo. I think there was a Supreme Court case that said as much a few years back. So hypothetically, if the AF tried to solve global warming, the counterplan could just be EPA will implement new rules restricting carbon emissions. And that should bypass most of the blowback that would hit the White House. Maybe. Depends. Okay, politics is a strategy. There are a few different strengths and a few different weaknesses. In terms of strengths, politics dissents are great because much like critiques, they're applicable to a ton of different affirmatives. It's easy to get these things to link to lots and lots and lots of different AFs. What's great about that is you can run it all the time, and you can get way, way better at debating your politics dissent than the affirmative team could possibly hope to be. So you've got a big advantage there. It's also easy to get to an external impact. If you've heard a couple of my other lectures, you know that or you've had me judge you, you know I think it's very important for negative teams to be able to talk about an impact that the affirmative team is not capable of claiming. So if all of their impacts are about the environment, and we read dissents that are also about the environment, we're just in a big link term debate, basically. Like, we don't really have a dissent, we have answers to the case. The problem with that is they had 20 minutes to prep their case, and we're just reacting to them. So we're almost always going to be at a disadvantage if we're going for their impacts. However, a politics dissent lets us go from a debate that was initially about the environment and talk about something entirely different, like immigration reform. The ability to get to that external impact gives us something to weigh against the affirmative that the affirmative doesn't have a head start on. There's also a big knowledge gap between AF and neg on a politics dissent. Much like when negative reads their favorite critique, they know that critique much better than the AF does. Same goes with politics dissents. The more particular your scenario, the bigger this knowledge gap is going to be. So you can exploit that pretty effectively, especially in Parliament. And finally, politics is really useful with a host of different counterplans, as I just talked about, which means that you can kind of plug it into a lot of different strategies. So what we would do, for instance, is we would almost always, if we're reading an alt-actor counterplan, we would have some sort of relations dissent about why the United States shouldn't act in a certain region, plus a politics dissent, plus an alt-actor counterplan. Now we've got two different positions we can go for as net bends to the counterplan. Are some problems, though. The link arguments on politics dissents are usually pretty weak and generic. We talked about that earlier. I won't go into more detail here. It's often a tightrope act because politics dissents can be easy to answer with smart dissents. This is the problem of establishing a brink argument. All right, it's not always the easiest thing in the world to do. And they're vulnerable to scouting, which can lead to impact or link turn blocks. Everybody was reading healthcare politics for a long time while the Affordable Health Care Act was moving through the House and Senate, and everybody and their dog was reading massive blocks of impact turns against that dissent. We had to debate, one of my younger teams, I think I was still at Whitman at the time, was going up against one of the top-rated teams in the country from Southern Illinois. They read their politics dissent, and I coached them before the round. I said, if they read their politics dissent, do not read any defense at the top of it. read straight impact turns, and then spend the rest of your time elsewhere. We're going to go all in. We're going to kick out of the affirmative advantages, essentially, and go all in on our healthcare impact turns by trapping them into the debate. And it was like the biggest round they ever won. So there you go. Pat on the back for Nick. And the debaters. They did a good job. Okay, so you got to watch out for that. As a result, best practices for politics disads. I think it's good to have 2 or more disads available at any given tournament if you are a team that likes to read politics a lot. If you read the same scenario over and over and over, eventually everyone is going to figure out what you're doing, and they're going to cut really good answers to it. If you don't have that advantage of a knowledge gap, you will usually not be able to win a politics disad because your link arguments are probably pretty tenuous, even if you've done a good job cutting them. You also want to look for detailed linked arguments in prep. I like looking for lobbying contributions. Open Secrets is a great website for that. It breaks down every single member of the House and Senate's contributions by sort of sector that they're receiving them from, and it goes into pretty good detail, so you can get a lot of information there. Voting records are also really useful. GovTrack and Thomas, which is an acronym for something I don't know what, keep good track of voting records that you can look up and find out how does this senator usually vote on bills like this. Would this senator be opposed to or in favor of this bill? Here's some evidence. And finally, polling. This is great for figuring out if the plan is going to be popular or unpopular, i.e. it has big implications for like winners win type arguments. So pollingreport.com, it's actually pollingreport.com, not polling reports, sorry, is a great source for that. What they do is they aggregate just polling questions from every single poll that's published online in like an open source format, put it all in one place. So you can find like 15 years worth of polling data on a particular question like gay marriage or marijuana or the war in Iraq or something. I think it's also important to have a reason why your bill specifically receives the link. This is what we were talking about earlier, in that you have to prove that Backlash would affect your bill and not some other bill. That is also an answer to an argument called a thumper, which we'll talk about in a minute. I've only got like 3 more minutes before I need to let you go, and that sucks. So much more politics to talk about. And finally, I would suggest avoiding relying on politics as a primary option. I think that you're in a really good spot strategically if politics is your plan B. Right? If you have like a really sick relations disad that's like your go-to, and then you say, we're going to put politics out there too, see how they answer it, it's going to be our other option in the debate, I think that is the ideal use of a politics disad. I used to read politics on the negative in like probably 70% of my negative rounds, but we would only go for it maybe a quarter of the time. So it was an option, but it was like a back pocket option, which I think is probably the best approach. Really quick, answering politics, so we can talk about Thumpers. It's basically the same game as answering any disadvantage with a couple of minor exceptions. On the uniqueness level, you just say something like, that's not going to pass anyway, whatever. You probably want to cut a block of uniqueness arguments. You can cut these blocks in particular ways. You can make arguments like Democratic cohesion low, Democratic cohesion high, the opposite for the Republican Party. One useful trick in debating uniqueness on politics is to make arguments about things that they did not address in their initial shell. So a lot of politics disads will be like, this bill is going to pass, here's a whole bunch of Republicans that support the bill, which proves it's bipartisan. A really effective way to answer that argument or that uniqueness scenario is to respond by saying, aha, but actually a group of conservative Democrats are likely to oppose this bill because yada, yada, yada. The reason being they have not preempted that response. They're not expecting it, they don't have any evidence on the flow to deal with it, and it gives your PMR more flexibility to create sort of new magic. On the link debate, this is where you would want to bring up those arguments about how there's no reason that like universal preschool has a relationship to immigration. Senators would backlash on something else. You can also make all of the other sorts of no-link arguments that you would make against disads, but that is just one particular example that politics is especially vulnerable to. Link terms, there are a lot of like generic link terms to politics the same way there are a lot of generic links, right? Winners win can be a standard link term to politics. Media focus can be a link term to politics, right? If your bill is, or if the plan is in the news right now and everyone is talking about it, then you can be like, non-unique, your bill won't pass now because no one is talking about it. turn, the plan makes this issue go away and get out of the news, which creates space in the limelight for your bill from your politics dissent. Those are sort of silly arguments. The more specific your link turns, the better off you're going to be, obviously. Same rule applies. And finally, no impact, the bill doesn't matter. You guys know what that is. No one's typing, good. Okay, thumpers. Thumpers are a really useful argument. These apply technically to, like, hypothetically any dissad, but they are especially useful for a politics dissad. A thumper is an argument that says that other items on the legislative agenda or other factors that are occurring in reality will trigger the link to the dissad. In other words, it is a non-unique to the link argument of a politics dissad. It says that your links will occur no matter what. The Tea Party is a fantastic example of this. The Tea Party gets angry about literally everything. So it is nonsensical to be like the Tea Party is going to get angry about your plan. Well, yeah, they're going to get angry about the plan, but they're also going to get really mad about the debt ceiling. They're going to get really mad about every conceivable spending bill. They're mad about food stamps. They're mad about farm subsidies. They're mad about everything. So saying they get mad about the plan doesn't mean much. Another example would be if you anticipate that more leak information is going to come out about the NSA that's going to make Obama and the executive branch look really bad, then their link argument about how the plan kills Obama's credibility is not unique. It's going to occur one way or the other as Snowden continues to dribble out extra information. Fight over food stamps is just going to amplify partisanship in the House and the Senate, regardless of the plan. So their link argument about how the plan is going to increase partisanship doesn't really matter. Does this argument make sense? One of the things that we do on my squad before we go to a tournament is we update our list of thumpers, and we like to have like 4 or 5 of them that we just read all in a row. And we're like, good luck. You've got your pre-prepared link block, we've got our pre-prepared thumper block. In the MO and the PMR, we will see whose is better. Usually, these arguments are tough to overcome. This is another reason, right, why you need precise links when you're advocating a politics dissent. Okay, that's all I got for you. Any questions? Is everyone going to take my advice? Go run out and cut an exciting and awesome politics dissent? Oh yeah. What's up?
How effective and partly are political capitals finite, or not real, rather not finite?
Political capital is not real. I mean, I don't really like political capital arguments. I think they're incredibly ambiguous and really difficult to falsify. But I mean, there are people who definitely make those arguments. I think if you just back them up with evidence and especially empirical examples of why political capital is real and why political capital moves in the way you say it moves, then I think it becomes viable. But without that evidence, I think you can definitely win that political capital is not a useful conceptualization or metaphor for how politics gets done.
Okay.
Cool.
So you said that you always bring 2 politics disads into every tournament.
Try to.
What?
Try to.
Yeah. So coming from a small school, what should we do for that?
To prep against that?
No. I mean, it not having as many researchers. I mean, it's just 3 of us on our team will be researching. So.
You can still totally cut 2 politics disads. It just requires a bit of extra work. And I mean, the nice thing about politics is your ability to read them in lots and lots of different rounds means that it actually, writing 2 politics disads, or even just 1 politics dissad if that's all you've got time for, cuts down on the amount of negative research you need to do in other ways, right? So if you've got a sick politics dissad that you think is going to be good for winning some rounds, then you probably don't need to invest time cutting specific case negs to every conceivable affirmative under a given topic area. You've got a generic dissad that can apply in a lot of circumstances. It takes the pressure off the rest of the research.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, I thought you were meaning into every round you had 2 politics written out.
Oh, no. No, I mean have 2 politics in your file at the tournament.
Okay.
And then, so what we will actually do at Texas Tech is we keep a list of everyone that we've read a particular politics dissad in front of. We want to know, has Washburn seen this dissad, has Southern Illinois, has William Jewell, etc. And if we get to the point where, we know, if we're in a deep elim and SIU has already seen this politics dissad twice, they know it's coming. So that's when we're switching gears and we're going with the other one.
Okay.
If you guys know Joe Allen, my partner and I back when he was only in his 4th year of debate, my senior year, which is hilarious. Yeah, we've been reading this North Korea politics that I was talking about, like, for 2 tournaments in a row. We were debating them in finals, and they were so pissed off when we switched the disad on them. And they still read like half their answers anyway, and we were like, wrong disad, man, not the same story anymore, that's not gonna work. Yeah, so that can be fun.
Awesome.
Good deal. Topic announcement should be coming up soon, so we'll get over there.
Thanks, Nick.